Welcome. If you're just joining us, go ahead and say hi in the chat and maybe say where you're joining us from. Let's go ahead and get started. So welcome to today's webinar, training conversation for how you can build and manage relationships with journalists covering your community, or maybe your work, or maybe an issue that you care about, however you want to think about it. This is the second training in PEN America's Disinformation Resilience Training Series, and we're glad to have you with us. Let's say a little bit about our objectives for today's session. We want you to come away with an understanding of why we need to improve the link between communities and local media, what those needs are. You'll hear some best practices that journalists have shared with us for reaching out to a journalist and starting a relationship. And our guest speakers will share their experiences managing relationships between community members and the media. So ultimately, you'll have a basis for managing narrative power and helping to make sure that these relationships are as mutually beneficial as possible. Here's how we'll be spending our 60 minutes together. We're in the middle of a brief introduction, and then next we'll share information about why and how to build relationships with journalists covering your community. We'll spend around 22 minutes or so in conversation with the guest speakers based on questions that I've put together before opening it up for audience questions, and then we'll wrap up. I'd love to introduce the people you'll be hearing from today. I'm Kurt Sampsel, and I'm a senior program manager at PEN America, focused on helping communities cope with the challenges of disinformation. And sometimes that looks like talking about increasing access to reliable and trustworthy information, and that's a big part of today's conversation. I'm joined by two fabulous guest speakers who will be sharing perspectives and learnings from their work. Marlissa Collier is a staff writer and the managing editor of the Dallas Weekly, which is one of the most prominent Black newspapers serving the Dallas-Fort Worth area, having started publication actually 70 years ago. In 1954. Marlissa also serves as journalism pathway coordinator for the Dallas Free Press, and that work involves actually training students in the skills and practices of journalism. Thanks for joining us, Marlissa. And Edwin Robinson is Chief Strategy Officer of Faith in Texas, which is a Dallas-based organization that's part of the National Faith in Action Network and focuses on community organizing, civic engagement, and leadership development as well. Edwin is also an adjunct professor in the School of Labor and Urban Studies at the City University of New York. And this is an academic department that's focused on how cities work and how they affect the lives of the people who live and work in them. So Marlissa and Edwin, thank you so much for joining us today. I'll say a little bit about PEN America. PEN America is a national 501c3 nonprofit, nonpartisan organization that works to support free expression in the United States and worldwide. And part of that work is focused on disinformation. Even though we are a free speech organization, we care about disinformation because we believe it undermines our public discourse, it heightens divisions and conflict, and it weakens the democratic system upon which ultimately our free expression rights rest. And when it comes to disinformation, our focus is on empowering information consumers, community leaders, and journalists to better understand the challenges of disinformation and ultimately develop resilience against it. I'll add a quick note regarding today's conversation. PEN America always aims for our events to promote dialogue and conversation and the free expression of diverse viewpoints. We do not tolerate harassment, abuse, or heckling, however. I don't anticipate any of those issues will arise today, but if there are disruptions, we'll provide people with a warning, and we may end up removing people from the webinar if disruption continues. At the end of today's webinar, I will provide my personal email address. It's my professional email address, but it goes directly to me, let's put it that way. And anyone is welcome to contact me directly with any question that's on your mind, and I'm committed to providing a tailored and thoughtful response. So thank you for understanding. This webinar is part of our Disinformation and Community Engagement Program, which is focused on serving people in Miami, Dallas-Fort Worth, and Phoenix. The idea behind this work is that we feel that communities in these diverse Sunbelt states may be experiencing similar challenges when it comes to the information environment that can provide learning experiences for each other and for communities more broadly speaking. So I sometimes think of these cities as kind of our laboratories or our case studies. And today we're sort of using Dallas as a case study because our two guest speakers are from there, but I'm confident that this session will be relevant for you regardless of where you live. By the way, let's be clear about why we're talking about relationships between communities and journalists in a broader conversation about disinformation. We know that when media coverage is flawed, incomplete, or sort of surface level, that leaves gaps that can be filled with false or inaccurate information that can ultimately deceive the public or leave us simply confused. So helping to ensure all communities and issues are more fully reflected in media is one way to get ahead of information gaps that can lead to incomplete understandings of communities and the things that matter to them. This is the second in a series of webinars that are designed to help develop capacity to better navigate our information environment in this challenging and important year. Some of the topics we have planned are things like strategies for amplifying civic information effectively, media monitoring tips, a look at disinformation trends that we've seen, and strategies for effective fact-checking. We'll share best practices, resources, and you'll hear from experts as well. By combining training content with panel conversations, we try to make sure that you come away with both learnings and perspectives on these issues. By the way, you can suggest topics that you'd like us to cover when you complete the survey at the end of today's session, so don't be shy about that. As a final part of this introduction, I want to share, or perhaps remind you if you've heard about it before, a little bit about a special part of PEN's counter-disinformation work, and that's empowering trusted messengers. So throughout 2024, we'll be producing a set of conversation guides and trainings to help people talk about how to access reliable information as part of their, regular daily lives with friends, family, coworkers, and so on. And to do this work, you don't need to be an expert in social media algorithms or propaganda techniques or anything like that. You just need to have a spirit of curiosity and helpfulness and a handful of proven techniques that we'll share with you. We have a set of free conversation workshops that are coming up actually in our 3 service areas, and we'll post links to the chat if you want to learn more and register to attend one. They're actually next week. So I'll put these in the chat for you. Just a moment. Great. All right. Let's go ahead and get into our main content. I'm first going to share some data to cover the why of building relationships, in other words, why it's important or worth doing to develop a relationship with your local media. And then I'll get into the how of actually establishing a relationship, focused specifically on how to approach journalists with that initial contact or request. So Pew Research Center has done some really incredible research on people's perspectives on their local media. And there's good news and bad news, no pun intended. Starting with the good news, the research shows that people think local journalism is actually pretty important to their community and its well-being. 85% of US adults, according to this research, think local journalism is at least somewhat important to their community. So local news is still quite highly valued by most people. People think that there's an important link between their community's health and their local news. But now let's get into some of the less encouraging data. So while 85% of people think local journalism is important to the community, if you ask local journalists who are, if you ask if local journalists are actually in touch with their community, there is less enthusiasm here. So only about 2/3 of respondents feel local journalists are really in touch, while a third say that they're out of touch. This is not a terrible figure by any means, but I think you'd agree there's room for improvement when it comes to journalists being in touch. There are also some issues when it comes to coverage. When Pew researchers ask people if their local news actually covers the area where they live, their actual community, their neighborhood, their town, only about half said that the news mostly covers their area, while another half said coverage is generally focused somewhere else, like a nearby city. So again, while the vast majority of people think a community connection is important, the actual strength of that connection could be a bit better. Now, what about coverage of issues? This is even less encouraging. When asked if the news they read covers the issues and events that they care about, fewer than half of respondents said yes, only 48% on average. And you can see something interesting and pretty concerning in the graphic here, which is that people's race plays a fairly significant factor in this question of issue coverage. So for white respondents, actually a little over half, 54%, say the news often covers the issues that are important to them. The percentage is lower, however, for Black respondents, only 40%. And it's even worse for Asian and Hispanic people with percentages in the 30s. So taken together, these three data points that we've just looked at suggest that news organizations and journalists can definitely be doing a little bit better when it comes to connecting with communities and serving their needs. But it's only fair, I think, to take a look at the other side of that relationship for a moment as well. One of the things that Pew researchers asked participants is whether or not they've ever connected with a journalist, if they've ever spoken to one or been interviewed by someone in their local media. And the vast majority of people, 78%, said they've actually never even spoken to a journalist. Only 21% of people have. And like we saw a few minutes ago with the issue coverage question, who you are, your background, your demographics makes a difference here. So let's take a look at that. That 21% of people who have never spoken to a journalist, that's an average. And some people are below or above that average. So for white people, the percentage is a little bit higher than that. It's 23%. And for Black and Hispanic people, it's lower than that average, just 19 and 14%, as you can see here. And there are some other demographic features that are a factor here. So age is a factor. That is something that I think is to be expected because older people have simply had more opportunities in their lives to have talked to a reporter at least once. But the education level and the income differences to me are quite significant and kind of concerning. 27% of people with at least a college degree have talked to a journalist compared to just 14% with just a high school education or less. Similarly, 26% of people who make over $75,000 a year have spoken to journalists compared to 17% making less than 30. In many ways, these findings aren't, really surprising because they mirror many of the inequities that we see in a lot of other areas of our social life. But they're definitely concerning because, of course, a major implication of having spoken to a journalist or not is whether your perspective has been included in news coverage or not. So this is pretty serious stuff. So to me, all of this Pew Research Center data that we looked at is one way that we can understand the why of building relationships with journalists. Why was that important? Why is that worth doing? People clearly value local journalism's connection to their communities, but feel that those connections could be stronger. And at the same time, only 21% of people on average report that they've ever even spoken to a journalist, meaning there's an incredible opportunity for community members to play a bigger role in improving that connection. So I want to be clear here that I'm not blaming news consumers in this moment. There are a lot of structural barriers, biases, and so on that make it hard for people to shape the news. And we'll get into some of that, I think, with our panel conversation later. And at the same time, one of the biggest reasons community members aren't building that relationship with journalists is I think oftentimes they don't realize that they can. Alicia Bell is a media activist based in North Carolina who has spent years doing journalism workshops with community leaders. And Alicia says that something she heard over and over again in these workshops is the idea that people often don't know how easy it is to reach out to a journalist and to hold them accountable. This is something that community members can do. But of course, the way that you initiate that relationship will help determine if it's effective or not. So now let's transition from the why of building relationships with journalists to a little bit more of the how, specifically kind of the nuts and bolts. For the purposes of this webinar, we surveyed journalists from across the country about how they prefer to have community members reach out and work with them. And we're going to share what we heard in that survey. The first question that we asked our journalists is about that first step to sharing information, pitching a story, or just reaching out for any initial contact, which might just look like trying to meet a journalist for coffee or to get to know each other a little bit. There was consensus that finding the right person to contact is a key to success. You should spend some time looking at news organizations' websites to find journalists who have written about your issue or your work or your community. And once you do, it is okay to go ahead and email or call them directly. Looking at staff profiles is a good option, but you can also search most news websites for news articles, and you can use keywords like pollution, public transit, housing, whatever it is that you care about to find stories that have been written in that outlet. And then you simply look at who wrote them and consider reaching out to those journalists. If you end up really struggling, one thing you can do is to try an editor or news director, because in general, they usually know their staffs really well. Usually you can just look for staff members with those terms in their job titles, news editor, news director. and reach out that way. And also something that our journalists acknowledged is that it's fairly common for requests to go ignored the first time, and you shouldn't take that as a sign of failure or a sign that the journalist isn't interested. Instead, they suggest that you follow up one time, and then maybe try a different approach, like using social media direct message or a phone call, as opposed to just repeating an email. But one time, they seem to say, is a good rule of thumb. So don't pester, don't email or call over and over and over, something that they suggested. So just out of curiosity, what happens if you do reach out to the wrong journalist? The answer is probably nothing at all. One journalist that we surveyed, a voting reporter in Wisconsin, said that when he gets pitches that don't relate to his beat, he deletes them automatically. I appreciate the honesty here, right? It illustrates why finding a relevant journalist is really key. We then asked about the do's and don'ts of reaching out to suggest a story or to ask a journalist to cover something. Our journalist responses fell into sort of two buckets here. First, being clear about why the thing in question it matters, why it's important, and then the idea of just kind of being considerate of all the logistics. So with the why it matters part, you should be clear about the significance of the thing you're interested in or want to talk about to the community. You should talk about what your goal is or what your mission is, and maybe what the scope of the problem is as well, and maybe how what you're asking about relates to actual news or emerging events. Our journalists also emphasize that helping a bit with logistics can go a long way to getting them to say yes to your request. This means things like giving them plenty of notice and not reaching out last minute. Also, if you're able to provide photos or documents, if you have any, that can be really helpful. And something that several of the journalists mentioned is the idea of helping the journalist out by finding people in advance who are willing and ready to be interviewed for a potential story. Sources are always really important for a news story, and if you can do some work in advance to find sources for the journalist, it will just make it that much easier for them to make a plan to get started, because you've kind of done some of the work for them. You have a leg up. This last point really stood out to me because it makes so much sense, but it's something that I probably wouldn't have thought of unless a journalist told me about it. One Pennsylvania-based investigative journalist said that having one or two people who are willing to be interviewed already lined up makes a huge difference. She said it's much harder to write a story about something if no one wants to talk about it. And of course, it's also just harder if you need to do the work of finding sources than if someone suggests them for you or finds them for you. So obviously, this means you will need to do some work in advance before you reach out to a journalist, but the results could be much better than if you don't. We also asked about things you should avoid doing when you reach out to a journalist. One of the common responses that we saw is that people should never demand coverage or expect for a story to get written. It's important to remember that you are requesting something and you should be polite about it. Our journalist said it's really upsetting when people get angry about not getting covered or when they accuse them of not caring about the issue or try to sort of monopolize a journalist's time. The other major bucket of things to avoid is trying to control the process too much. This can look like things like CCing top editors or others in the organization at the same time that you reach out to somebody, or telling the reporter how to do their job, asking to review drafts of articles before they go out, and even just kind of going back and forth about the question of being anonymous or not, which can sometimes feel like you're threatening blackmail or manipulating the journalist in order to get them to do what you want. A lot of this is just basic humility and etiquette, and again, keeping in mind that this is a request, not a demand or not an order. Trying to exercise too much control is a major pet peeve of journalists, and understandably so. One New York-based freelance journalist encouraged members of the public to suggest a story, but to not tell the journalist how to write it or what to write, emphasizing that the media does not exist to be your PR agency. That's a completely different industry and completely different people who are working hard to do their work. It's important to remember that journalists are professionals who have specific styles, they have specific ways of working, and they have a lot of limitations on what they're able to do. So don't kind of backseat drive their process. Something I want to say here, just to be clear, is, this guidance about not controlling the process, that does not mean that you need to be passive, and it does not mean that you need to allow the journalist to have all the control while you have none. You're absolutely allowed to ask questions. You can get clarity about how the journalist views the issue or the topic that you're talking about or dealing with. And you can even raise concerns about how you've seen the issue covered by the media in the past, as long as you don't attack the specific person you're talking to. You also deserve to feel comfortable when you share your story, and you can decline requests that you don't feel good about. So, yes, to be clear, the journalist is not your PR agency. That is true. That is still true. But also, you're not the journalist's unpaid research assistant or community liaison, right? So we'll talk more about balancing this control with our guest speakers, because it really is one of the most challenging aspects of this work. Taking a step back from specific do's and don'ts, we asked our journalists what the general public just doesn't understand about journalists and their work. This seemed important for developing empathy and really developing a relationship with a journalist, and not just a one-time pitch or request or a single ask. One idea that was universal in the responses is that journalists are busy and they have limited resources, meaning that they just can't cover every important story that comes their way, even if they want to. Several folks emphasize that when a journalist is unable to cover something that you care about, you should not take it as a sign that they don't care. And if you can, you shouldn't take it personally. There was also this theme stressing that journalists are human beings who are trying their best under hard circumstances. They want us to know that they care about their communities and that they are making an effort. They appreciate when we're patient with them, when we respect their decisions, which are often difficult decisions, by the way. A few of our respondents wanted to share that even when they can't cover something, they still appreciate that they maybe had the chance to learn more about a new issue and perhaps meet a new person, because that can help them eventually write a story sometime in the future, perhaps. Related to these points, several of the folks we surveyed said that people often don't understand how long it can take to put stories together, so they appreciate patience. One Texas-based engagement reporter highlighted the work that can sometimes be invisible to the public, like working on several stories simultaneously, while also responding to breaking news and doing fact-checking work. We want to get things right, she said, to accurately tell a story and build trust with our readers. And yes, that is a thing that takes some time. Finally, we asked our journalists to share what they see as the recipe for a good relationship between a community member and a journalist. One of the major themes here is not surprising, but important, and that's mutual respect, especially respect for professional boundaries, requirements, limitations, busy calendars, and so on. This looks like, again, respecting the fact that a journalist may make decisions that you wouldn't make. They may write a story different than the one that you would write. It also looks like being mindful of logistics, responding to emails from reporters promptly, being reliable in that respect, being willing to provide information, and being willing to provide introductions. The other major theme here is one that kind of surprised me. Several of the journalists we surveyed said that they like to really get to know people and to stay in touch on an ongoing basis, even when it's not about a specific story or event or a bit of emerging news. And they say that they've appreciated when they've been able to build an ongoing dialogue with community members. So not just being contacted when someone, wants something from them. The reason that this surprised me is because I might personally have assumed that journalists are so busy that they would just kind of want me to leave them alone. But that doesn't seem to be the case. And this is great because, keeping in mind that journalists can't cover everything, when you do have your initial contact to one, you can directly say something like, hey, I understand if you can't cover this exact story, this exact time, but if you're interested in this topic, if you're interested in this line of coverage, if you want to hear about future ideas, or if you want to just kind of dig deep into this in the future, we can have a larger conversation. Please let me know. So in other words, you can indicate in your contact to them that there are several options. It's not just a single offer, a single ask that you're making. One Pennsylvania-based former editor and producer tied these threads together by saying that in a good community member journalist relationship, there's respect for logistics and both people know the value of the relationship. She really emphasized that each party has something to offer, saying, you can help me tell compelling stories. and I can help you share what you're working to do. So I think reflecting on that is really key to making sure that the relationship is mutually beneficial. I really like the way that she put that. All right, I hope that this overview has been helpful. At this point, we're going to go a little bit deeper into how to manage relationships between communities and media by hearing from our guest speakers, Marlissa Collier and Edwin Robinson. Okay, so I'm going to start with a question for you, Edwin. Something that I'd love to have you just start with as an introduction is if you could say a little bit about what you do at Faith in Texas and share how, working with the media can sometimes be a part of that work.
Sure. Again, thanks for being here. Well, it's a pleasure to be here. Thank you to everyone who is here. And Kurt, you have like the perfect NPR voice, man. Like, so it's so dope hearing you
Thanks.
do these spaces. So Faith in Texas in particular, we are a broad-based community organizing organization, right? Community organizing, ever since President Obama has been like a sexy thing for everyone to call themselves. But it is a particular skill. And so community organizing is about building base and building relationships with people to build collective power to actually transform systems, right? It's not about being the spokesperson. It's different from being just an advocate. It's different from being an activist. It's different from being a social influencer, right? All of those things are very important, right? So neither of these things are more important than the other. All very important, but it is a particular kind of skill. And so we developed that to build power with community to govern our shared society. We particularly do that through faith. I'm also clear that when I say faith, most people think religious institution, and that's okay. I've hung up trying to change that for people. But even though that is the case, we do organize through religious institutions, but we deeply organize through what people deeply believe in and how they work that out in the world. That's how we want to do our work. To that end, having relationships with journalists is very important, and having relationships with media is very important because part of building power and building base is being able to tell a good story and tell the story about what is happening and what is not happening. A lot of times, journalists they connect with whoever they have a relationship with immediately, and or the first person at the event, at the thing, who they have a conversation with. And it's usually the organizers who actually organized the event, who were there doing all the work, right? That even got us to the fact that we needed to have said thing going on. And the organizers usually have deep information about how we got here, why we're doing what we're doing, and who the players involved are. So having those relationships is just critical to sharing a real and true story.
Thanks so much. That's a great overview. I appreciate that. So, when we just shared some of the learnings from the journalist survey, and we shared them because I personally think that there is a lot of value in knowing how journalists think. It's something we're going to talk a lot about today, but it is only one perspective, and I would love to get yours. If you were talking with a community leader who didn't have any experience dealing with local media but wanted to get started, what are two or three top suggestions that you would give them, or things to be aware of that you would highlight for them?
Yeah, so there were a number of things that the journalists said that I thought were really interesting about their own sort of perspective out to the community. So we'll hit those things later. But to answer the question directly, I just think there are three things. One, you need to know why you want media coverage, right? And be clear about that. Like, it can be frivolous. It can be like, we just want media coverage because we just want That's fine. But be like clear, right, about why you want the media to show up. I think that's important. And then I think the next thing is to what end? If media comes and does a story on us, what does that get us? To what end?
Mm,
Right? And I think that's very a key thing to know. And then I think the third thing is in what way? Like, in what way would you like your story told? If you want your
mm.
story told, if you're trying to go viral on social media, then you probably shouldn't invite the Dallas Morning News, right? Like, you should probably invite someone who's hot on TikTok who is doing question and answering in journalism, right? If you want your coverage to be focused and speaking to the Black community, well, you should probably invite Black journalists, right? Not, the mainstream sort of, journalist in your space, right? So I think it's why do you want coverage? To what end, right? If we get this coverage, what, happens for us, for the broader community, and then
Mm.
in what way are we looking to have that shared? And I think that'll help to target is a word I'm really trying to get out of my language.
Mm.
It'll help you to focus your energy on who and why and what you're attempting to get done. And hopefully I can share more on other things later as we continue to talk.
Those are great. Thank you. I'm sure you saw me scribbling them down. Be clear about the why, think about to what end, think about how the story should be told. That's really good, Edwin. Thank you so much. Transitioning a little bit to hear from Marlissa. Marlissa, you work with both the Dallas Weekly and the Dallas Free Press. I said a little bit about what that looks like, but how would you describe the work that you do at those two organizations?
Yeah, so two different roles, but I guess the same goal. With the Dallas Weekly, I actually started writing for them as a freelance journalist back in 2022. So a year after Juneteenth became a federal holiday, and they asked me to pen a piece about Juneteenth and what it meant. And I took a bit of a different angle and talked about the commercialization of Juneteenth and how quickly it happened.
Hmm.
And so that led to me doing more writing for them. I became a full-time staff writer about a year ago, and then they made me managing editor this past March. So there is where you'll find me creating my content, right? I have my actual bylines with Dallas Weekly, but I also do a few video series for them. So anything from stand-up interviews to more so like series. So I have a series called Civics 101 where we explain the inner workings of the Dallas government because their setup is a little different than most cities in the way that it's structured. So we want people to understand how government works and how they can be civically engaged. And then on the other side with Dallas Free Press, I run a program called the Journalism Pathway. In this program, we work in three high schools, two in South Dallas and one in West Dallas. If you know anything about Dallas, you know that those areas are historically underserved. And so we're in Madison, Pinkston, and Lincoln. And my whole goal is to teach our kids how to tell their stories and to control the narratives of stories that are coming not only out of their schools, but out of their neighborhoods, from their families or churches, things like that. So one of the things that I noticed when I started the program, I just wrapped up my second year, my second class. But when I started the program, I noticed that, number one, these kids were coming back into the classroom after quarantine. And so they were behind as high schoolers, not only with storytelling, but simple reading and writing, sentence structure. And so we
Hmm.
had to kind of take it from the base level with some of our students and really build them up to being comfortable reading and writing comprehension, but then also being able to go out, gather stories, gather information, digest it, repackage it, and give it back. So on one side, I develop content. On the other side, I help people develop content, young people.
Hmm.
Yeah.
That's great. Thank you. Um, I like that you teach young people how to control narratives. That's definitely something we're gonna get into today. A question that I had for you, Melissa, in preparing for this conversation, I was looking a little bit at the Dallas Weekly's about Us page, and one of the things that it says to kind of explain the outlet and its values and its approach to its work is, it says the staff of the Dallas Weekly take great pride in the fact that we speak to and for our community in ways to ensure that we remain a part of and never apart from those whom we serve. I was really struck by that. And I wonder if you could say a little bit about what that means to you and what kinds of things you do to put that into practice.
Yeah, for sure. So one thing you all should know about me is I refused to join Dallas Weekly full time until I knew that I was going to have a place where I could do the type of work that I wanted to do. And so I did not join them full time until they published one article where they took a bold enough stand that no one else was taking in any publication in Dallas. And when I saw it, I text the publisher and was like, "You got me now. I am willing to work with y'all full time now." So For me, I have always been about speaking for those who don't get a seat at the table. I am from South Central Los Angeles. I'm not supposed to be here, to say the
Mm,
least of it. I am not supposed to be here, but the stars aligned and God was good and my mama was great. And I got all the opportunities to allow me to sit in rooms that my sisters and my cousins and my uncles still cannot sit in because they either don't have the education, they may not be articulate enough, and I actually think that we have the data to back this up, Kurt, right? Based on what you just showed, how many people have spoken to a reporter. We know that reporters tend to go after people who look a certain way, who make a certain amount of money, who have a certain level of education. And so I wanted to be that bridge builder. And so as the editor, I push my team to be that bridge for people who need to get their stories out there, but it may not be accepted in the mainstream because of maybe the way they look or the way they speak or they don't have the qualification. So for me, it is very important for us to talk to people in the community. And even if we aren't telling stories, just to show up, like, Edwin was just talking before we started about being at Mocha. Sometimes I just go work there so people can see my face and know, like, we're out here, like we're actually in these streets with y'all. So yeah.
that's great. Thanks for sharing that. I'm really curious, just as a quick follow-up. You use the word qualifications to talk about sources or the people you might be talking about. Can you just say a few sentences about what you're thinking of when you say that?
Yeah, I think a lot of times we lend ourselves to respectability politics. I
Mm,
think a lot of times people are expected to, like I said, speak a certain way or have a certain level of formal education, um, or lest they aren't considered valuable. Their thoughts and their experiences aren't considered valuable, but some of the smartest people I know never went to college, and instead they learned about the world by being all over the world and reading books and having conversations with people with different mindsets and thoughts and ideas.
mm,
So yeah, I try not to lean on like, hey, what's your resume? When I'm using someone for a source or tapping someone for a source, but rather what's your experience with this thing? Like, have you been on the ground in it? And if so, then you can tell me firsthand. And we'll paint that context in the story, right? Like we'll talk about the lens that this person is looking through, but I don't always think it has to be point A, point B, point C in order to be a valuable voice in a story.
mm. Thanks for sharing. I appreciate that. Um, I want to go ahead and get into this question of narrative power because I just think it's so important. Like we said, it's not a journalist's job to tell whatever story I want, like a PR person, but it's also not my job to just kind of give free help so that a journalist can tell whatever version of the story they want without any input or involvement. So I'd love to hear both of you say a little bit about how you think of narrative power and how do you believe that it should be managed or shared in the best case scenario. Let's start with Edwin.
Thanks for that. So narrative power is very important. I have a working definition of narrative power. I'm going to describe it in the chat. I say
Mm,
it's to have fair and equitable space in shaping the story and ultimately the common sense of a social group, or you can say a cultural space or a geographical space or something like that.
mm,
Um, but the ability to have fair and equitable space in shaping the story, I think is very important. And I think that, in a place like Dallas where we are not a media desert, but like there's like a media like oligarchy, if you will. The
mm,
Dallas Belo group, like it like is this 100,000 pound gorilla, right, controlling a lot of the media narrative. And whether you have, tons of media outlets in your space or just small, a few media outlets in your space, I think it's important for you to for us to tell our own stories.
mm,
And, you know, we have the internet, you know what I'm saying? So I'm very clear with my group. We're going to tell our story before the media tells our story. Whatever story the media gets, we've already told it, right? And so I encourage people, particularly with social media. I'm not saying that you have to go and hire a social media director or a communications director, or you need to go and get somebody who like can trick the algorithm, right? But like you need one, if you're an organization, before you go out and ask a journalist to come and share your story, have a website. It can be a janky website, but have a website where your story can live, right? Do the work of writing out our own story, right? If you're not a great writer, like, do a video and record your story, post it online before you go and tell the media. Because at the end of the day, the media is going to tell the story. We're not just the media, everybody is going to tell a story through their own perspective. I don't care how, you know, fair or whatever someone is saying. When you tell me a story and I repeat said story, it is going to filter through my perspective. I'm going to tell that story through my perspective. And I need to be able to be fact checked. So someone needs to be able to go and look at your website or your Facebook page or your Instagram or your TikTok and see from your mouth what the story is that you were trying to tell. That's the way that we control narrative power for telling our own stories. And so I think that like we can, like you said, the media is not our PR. Now they are PR for some other people. They're PR for whoever's paying their bills. Let's keep it above. Okay. Whoever is writing that check, they are PR for them. The end. But they're not PR for the people who ain't writing their checks. So we have to be able to at least have our stories living somewhere where we've told them on our own before they get to tell them for us.
That's great. That's great advice. Thank you. And it resonates with me because in preparing for this conversation, I looked at your websites and I looked at your LinkedIn's and I looked at your organization's websites and about us pages to get a sense, like, just as a foundation about what, who you guys are and what the work is that you do. So that's a great piece of advice to get started. Marlissa, I'd love to hear you share your thoughts about this. How do you think about narrative power, and how do you believe it should be managed or shared in a best case scenario?
Yeah, I mean, before I was a journalist, I was a writer, and the way an artist's job is to reflect the times, a writer's job is to tell the truth. And so that was always my charge to myself. And as a journalist, I take that with me. But I loved when Edwin said that your story is going to be filtered through my perspective. And you have to remember that my perspective is that of a Black queer woman from Los Angeles who grew up in poverty and now has a little bit of privilege, right, in Dallas. So you have to remember that when I start to tell your story, that there is always going to be that lens. So I think it's actually really important to make sure that you are going to the right type of journalist for the type of story that you want to tell, right? So for me, if you go and read any of my bylines, you will notice that you learn more than just the topic at hand. I'm always going to create some type of umbrella of context. So it may be historical context. I may bring in policies that allow this thing to happen. I'm going to educate people so that it's more than just, hey, the state of Texas just released this new educational curriculum that includes Bible scriptures. I'm also going to tell you why that's probably against the law and unconstitutional, and explain that, right? The historical context, but also the policy piece. Well, if you don't want that, then you should probably go find someone who has a history and a style of telling the story just straightforward. So I do think that you have to know the style of the journalist that you're coming after, right? You wouldn't go hire a hip hop dancer to do a tap number for your showcase. And I think once you really do your homework and you understand their storytelling ability and style, that's helpful. From there, I do always ask any subject that I'm interviewing, like, hey, are there any things that you absolutely want me to put in here? Are there any things that you absolutely want me to leave out? There may be something that can't be said right now for any number of reasons. So I tend to allow, folks who I talk to drive some of the content. But I can honestly say that I am not one who has ever allowed anyone to change my style in how I write and how I present stories. So yeah.
That's great. And you shared the idea of getting clear as a journalist about what's something that should absolutely be included or absolutely not be included. And of course, somebody can lead with that from the perspective of a reader or a community member or a community leader. It's simply say, hey, here's something that is really important for me that you include, or really important that that this perspective is included or not included or whatever. Thanks for sharing that. Sure, Edwin, I see you want to weigh in. Go ahead.
Yeah, I just want to say, thank you, Marlissa. That was really great. That was just a short story. Like, we were doing this work at City Hall, and it's Dallas Black Clergy for Safety, Equity, and Justice. And I was talking to this reporter, and I said, "Hey, we're doing this, that, and the other, and I feel like you all won't cover us, but you're covering all these other people." And she said to me, without equivocation, she just looked at me and said, "Well, a bunch of Black pastors showing up at City Council is not news." And so now I was upset personally. Now, nevertheless, I appreciated her saying that, though, because now I was clear about her perspective. So I just did not reach out to her any longer because I was wasting my time. Because to her mind, our work was not newsworthy, right? But it also spoke to me all the other things that I said before this. I was clear then that she may not be the only one with that perspective. And so it's going to be very important that we start telling our story on our own, because to some people who have the power to tell our story, it just may not be newsworthy. And that's cool, because it's her job, not mine. You know what I mean?
Mm.
Yeah, I would say, and when as soon as you said that, I was like, well, that's the history of Dallas, right? Like, you read the accommodation and you know that Black clergy has been front and center through the fight for, integration, for desegregating the fair, all of that. So at first I was thinking, like, in her mind, she's like, yeah, y'all been doing this. Y'all been showing up to be civically engaged. But for me, in my head, the story is, all right, well, let's talk about the history and the impact that the Black clergy has had on, the policy progression of Dallas, because that's a story that I don't think anyone has ever told. And it is an important one that continues to be front and center. Like, what's that? Friendship West still has the Black Lives Matter banner flying off of 30 right there, right? And was willing to go toe to toe with the Klan just a few years ago because they had that. So for me, I think it's an important story. I think for her though, she just didn't look past the initial the initial event that was going on.
Hmm. Folks, if you have questions, in a minute, we're going to transition to audience questions. So you can go ahead and gear up by putting a question that you have in the chat. And in just a minute, I will refer to those. Before we get to that, I want to ask Edwin a question that is kind of related to what you were talking about earlier, this question of, somebody else telling your story for you. I think the reality is that even when everybody's acting in good faith, there are really a lot of opportunities for things to go wrong with media coverage, and for the people who work with the journalists to end up feeling hurt or disappointed or frustrated or whatever. Someone else is telling your story for you. This is a really sensitive thing. I'm curious to hear, it sounds like you have experienced this, and when something like that happens, what do you think can be done?
Yeah, you should, when your story's not told the way you want it told, then say something and say it loud, and say it everywhere you can. Tag the people who told the story wrong on social media. And if they don't get results, then show up at their office and say, hey, you didn't tell this story. And I think that's important. We don't just let it slide. Case in point, after a number of Black people were being murdered across the country by police. Our dear brother Philando Castile was murdered, and there were uprisings here in Dallas. And I think people who are here and maybe nationally know, right, that there was this major rally that happened downtown, and at that rally, a sniper started shooting at police. Well, that's a story. There's a number of stories that need to be told here in the media. Dallas Morning News journalists decided to tell a particular kind of story, and they said, like, it was like massacre or melee or something crazy like that, right, in downtown Dallas. But which is real, that happened. It was really like that. But the picture that they chose to use was a picture of the folks who were actually doing the rally, not the dude who, you know what I mean, who was doing the stuff. So they use this picture of an activist and organizer, Dear Cicero, Linka Green, screaming into a microphone with great passion to tell a story about some sniper who ambushed police. And so I immediately saw it. I reposted it and I tagged the Dallas Morning News. I tagged the editor. I tagged everybody. And I said, this is not the story that needs to be told. And then we went and I called the editor and I said, this is not okay. Well, they said, hey, sorry, we were trying to get something out quickly and they used the wrong picture. I said, well, what are you going to do? And so they printed a retraction and changed the picture. But that's not the only time this happened. This happened, another time. So I say that to say journalists make mistakes often in the same way we all make mistakes often. And those mistakes don't need to just get swept under the rug. We need to absolutely say something, tag folks. And if they didn't do something about it, then we escalate. If we had to show up to Dallas Morning News, we were going to show up at Dallas Morning News and say, hey, what's up? And so we don't just let those things happen to us. We actually use that as an opportunity to create greater dialogue. And that's what it did. After that, me and the person who was the editor at the time, we ended up having a great relationship. And whenever something will go wrong, I would text. I would be like, hey, what's up, man? That's not the story. And he would do his level best to try to fix it. And I think that's ways that we actually build relationships with journalists by holding one another accountable, right? To misinformation or disinformation that's put in the public space.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Thanks. Folks are still welcome to add questions to the chat, but just kind of curious, would you add anything to that, Marlissa?
Yeah, so I mean, I had an incident myself where I missed a single word in a quote from a city council member, and a single word can change the whole meaning. So it was a typo. I don't know how I missed it, but anyway, it was brought to my attention, and her office actually contacted me, and they were just up in arms, right? Because I mean, media can sometimes, depending on who's covering you, right, try to cover you a certain way. That was not my intention. So I actually went to the office. I sat down with the city council member and let her know that it was not at all my intention. And if you looked at the rest of the story, you could actually see that it didn't even make sense for me to put that quote right there, because I was actually, shining a pretty bright light on her. But for me, I'm always open to feedback, to correction if I do get something wrong. If there's something that I may have missed during an interview, I'm very big on just, hey, sending an email or a text or making a call like, hey, did I hear this right? Did I get this wrong? Because I wouldn't want anyone, misrepresenting who I am or the work that I do. And so I try to treat the subjects of any story that I'm writing in the same way. So I would say, especially if you've worked with this journalist before, y'all, give them the benefit of the doubt. We look at a lot of words all day long, and sometimes, you can miss something. And if it seems like there was no malice in it, chances are there wasn't. Now, if you were working with someone who is new and who may be like, trying to put something out for clickbait and stir up, mess, then I would definitely say, I'm taking Edwin steps, right? I'm sending some type of digital correspondence first, and if they don't respond then I'm probably knocking on your front door. So yeah.
Thanks for sharing that. I see Kate just added a question. Kate says, wondering whether many African Americans, especially younger ones, are reading journalists, and how do you get to those who aren't? What would you say about that?
Wondering whether African Americans, especially, are reading. It's my experience that they are not. So the reason I even got the editor's role at Dallas Weekly was because I had started a completely separate platform, actually on TikTok, when everybody was in quarantine and had nothing to do but doom scroll all day. And so I started just giving information to people about policy, not just domestic, but also foreign affairs. So I'm a policy nerd. I love politics. I think it's the best soap opera you can ever watch. And so I started doing politics in under 3 minutes, and I would do these video explainers, just helping people understand maybe a bill that the House had just passed or something that was going on, like a crazy abortion bill that was passed in one of the southern states or something like that. And so that platform grew really, really large. And what I noticed when I started looking at the stats of folks who were watching my videos, it was younger people. They were under the age of 30, the majority of them, and they wanted news and they wanted to understand how to be civically engaged and how government works, but they just don't read 1,500-word articles anymore. And so I kind of had to just meet them where they were. So I don't think that many of them are reading long form articles, but I do think that we have an opportunity to capture them with short, like video clips, minute and a half, and then let them know, like, hey, if you want to know more about this, there's a full article on this website. And so that's how I tend to drive younger people towards my written content.
Hmm. Tanya asked a question. We need to wrap up here in a minute, but Tanya asked the question, how do you balance accountability and managing a good relationship? So in other words, holding someone accountable, but not in such a kind of bold way that someone comes to, feel like they don't want to work with you or talk to you. Any advice you'd give about that, either of you?
Yeah, I'll go. I mean, I think at the end of the day, relationships are very important, but sometimes it doesn't like, first of all, people don't like to be held accountable. Let's just keep it a buck. Like you can like sometimes people receive accountability as a threat, and that's not my fault, right? Like you know what I mean? So if I hold you accountable and you see that as a threat, that's a you problem, not a me problem. And we just gonna have to go on in Jesus' name, as we would say in the church. But the other thing is, I think journalists also have to understand like the power. Like if you post a story and it's wrong, that story's already out there in the public. I don't have time to negotiate with you on the back end, right? Like I have to post something because it's already out there, right? So now before I even have a conversation with you, I need to post something to already begin countering what was said.
Mm.
And now I'm going to come back and have a conversation. So that's not like, and so if the journalist takes that as offense, well then like first realize the power of what was already done, right? So we have to kind of balance the scales a little bit, you know what I mean, on the front end. So I think that that's one. I think the other thing is, you know, it's easier, like if you can build relationships on the front end, it's easier to have these conversations on the back end. Like a journalist came to me and sat and was like, hey, you know, how can I cover stories better in the Black community and things like that? I said, well, my thing is, I feel like y'all do a lot of really good, nice, like cat stories in like white communities and more affluent communities. And you're not telling these like hard hitting, like crime stories that are happening in their communities. I said, but there are nice cat stories happening in Black communities. So maybe try telling some of those, right? A little bit. And you know, tell some hard-hitting crime stories, right, that are going on in these other communities. Like, let's balance the scales a bit, and I think it'll give people a better runway into having conversation.
Mm. Well, thank you so much for sharing that. We do need to move on just to make sure that we hit our time markers and wrap up promptly, but it's been so helpful hearing from you, Edwin and Marlissa. Thank you so much. And if we didn't get to your questions, I apologize. So something that I want to do is to share a brief survey. I'm doing that right now in the chat. I'd really appreciate if you can take a moment to just click the link to make sure that it works. Your feedback is really important to us, so you can help us out by sharing your thoughts about, what was most useful for you from today's conversation. What kind of things do you think you might do differently as a result of hearing or getting exposed to some of these ideas? And also, we want to know what ideas you have that we could consider in the future for additional trainings, webinars, and other events like this. And that is it. Thank you so much for joining us. And of course, special thanks to Edwin and Marlissa for being so generous with their time and their thoughts and sharing their perspectives. You can reach out to me and you can learn more about PEN America's work on disinformation resilience at the addresses that you see on this screen, including my email, which is ksampsel@pen.org. Thanks so much for joining us. Thanks, Marlissa and Edwin, and hope to catch you next time. Take care, folks.